Let's take a look at one of the other adjustments here inside of Photoshop CS3 that's very useful when trying to edit your shadows and highlights, and it is aptly called Shadow Highlight. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up underneath the image menu, we're going to choose Adjustments, and we're going to come all the way down to Shadow Highlight. Now, what this allows you to do is open up specific regions of your image, either in the shadows or the highlights, and it's really a great function here that's going to allow you to gain more control over these regions. For instance, if I wanted to gain a little bit more control over my shadows here, if I wanted to open those up, like let's say that I feel that some of these areas down here in the bottom are too dark, if I push this up a little bit, you'll see that I get a very visual representation of what that's doing down here at the bottom, because I'm really opening up this little dark region down here, this little dark gray region. Let me reset that to where it was originally. And you'll see here how much I significantly lighten that up by taking that shadow up like that. But I'm not affecting the highlights at all. So this is a great tool for controlling those specific aspects in different areas. So for instance, if I wanted to then take the highlight regions and tone them down, remember I was clipping a little bit of those highlights earlier? If I take these and I start to drag it to the right, then I start to tone down those highlighted regions there. And I'm actually bringing back in a lot of that detail up there in the sky where I was losing significant detail, and I'm also starting to bring back a little of the area on the nose of this dragon as well. So you can see how this is a very visual and also a very powerful tool for independently controlling both your shadows and your highlights. And this is also going to be a very effective tool for those of you who do not like to use the levels or curves dialog box, simply because of the fact that those might be a little bit more advanced. This is a very simple and very visual way of editing these things without having to worry with the complications of output numbers and sliders and things like that. So let's go ahead now and we'll take a look at these more options that they have inside the Shadow Highlight dialog box. We'll just click that little drop down menu there, and for some of you this might be a little bit too advanced, so if you really don't care anything about this, that's totally okay. You don't have to worry about this to make the actual command work, but this is going to give you just a little bit more control over the individual areas of your images. For instance, now you can control the amount and the tonal width of both of the shadows and the highlights, as well as the radius of the shadow highlights as well. So for instance, if I want to, let's say, darken up the shadows here in this image, we'll just take those down a little bit, and let's say we also want to increase the tonal width. Let's say we want to affect maybe even a little bit more into the midtones, so we'll just kind of drag this to the right to start affecting those areas in the midtones as well. We can do that the same for the highlights as well. If we want to darken in some of those highlighted regions, but we also want to affect some of the midtones as well, we can start to drag that to the right as well to start darkening up those midtones. Or conversely, if we wanted to go ahead and lighten up some of the areas, we could just drag this backwards and we would lighten up the areas in the midtones in the tonal width. So we're actually restricting the tonal width of the highlights there. So you can either contract or expand the tonal width of these. You can also control the radius of these as well, which is going to give you a little bit more control over the broadness of the area that you're affecting. So these are just more precise controls that you can have at your disposal here inside of the Shadow Highlight dialog box. Now, if you don't want these type of controls here, that's totally fine. You can always come down here and turn them off by clicking the Show More Options button again. But this is just, in my opinion, a better way to work with Shadow Highlight, simply because you do get all of these extra controls. And the best part about this is probably the Adjustments tab down here at the bottom, where you have the ability to adjust color correction here, which is going to adjust for the distortions in color when you either open up the shadows or open up the highlights or darken the shadows or highlights, vice versa. So the color correction, you can actually increase the amount of color correction that it throws in here or decrease it, which is going to allow for a little bit more color distortion. You can also come down here and adjust the mid-tone contrast, which is actually a pretty powerful thing in and of itself to increase the contrast between the midtones, shadows, and highlights. That's just going to give you more of that punchy feel to your photographs, and that's really where you get into some better looking images, in my opinion, when you increase that mid-tone contrast, simply because it gives you more of a defined line between both your shadows and highlights. So just play around with these options, tweak them to where you see fit, because there's really no specific guideline for setting all of these. It's just really based on an image-to-image basis. So you can use these and see how powerful of a little tool this really can be, and how actually great it is for a nice visual yet very simple way of editing your digital photographs.